Here we're going to take a look at how mainly China reacted to the West, because Western European nations are going to start showing up and demanding that China take a subordinate role where they previously have been more dominant, so to speak. Now, when we look at the Ming Dynasty, Ming meaning bright or light, a peasant, Ming Taitsu, led the revolt that kicked this dynasty off. And initially, he wasn't all of that fond of Confucian ideals, but he reinstated them because staffing his new bureaucracy was subsequently difficult. And this will lead to a new emphasis on Confucian ideology and those Confucian relationships. All subjects are expected to blindly obey the emperor, who will model good behavior that was in the best interest of his subjects. It's also during this dynasty that what we call the Forbidden City. The Forbidden City is going to be completed, which houses the emperor and his court. Now, as opposed to previous methods like collecting taxes and farmed goods, the Ming decided in the 1570s that they would use silver for the purpose of tax collections, and this will create a massive global demand for it. And although some silver does come from Japan, much of it was mined and transported from the Western Hemisphere. So Spanish silver is going to be one of the first truly universal currencies, and Ming policy is going to help drive up its demand as well as its usage. Now, the Ming, during this time, they're collecting silver. Part of it will finance the completion of the Great Wall. But due to the insistence on this tax system, there will be inflation, and the economy will be more vulnerable to foreign concerns, like when the supply of silver is going to drop after 1620. The emperor is really going to start neglecting his duties and award prestigious positions based on nepotism rather than competence and talent. Internal rebellions will become a consistent occurrence, to the point where northern invaders are going to overthrow the Ming Dynasty, and we will enter the last Chinese dynasty, the Qing. Now, the Qing are also ethnically called the Manchu because they come from the northern area known as Manchuria. Now, in the 1590s, the Ming actually called upon the Manchu to resist this Japanese invasion that Toyotomi Hideyoshi had set off. Now, from their homeland, the Manchu emulated the bureaucracy of China, but they kept their own language and traditions. As time goes on, prominent Mongol and Ming generals will switch their allegiance to the Manchu, and in 1644, one of the rebel armies will storm the capital of Beijing. They'll take it over, and once again, northern barbarians will rule over China. Now, the Qing are able to expand from their homelands into China and Central Asia, and their land-based empire will be twice the size of their Ming predecessors. It's going to cover about 11% of the surface area of planet Earth, and to this day, it remains the fourth largest empire in all of world history. Now, to justify their use of this mandate of heaven, the Qing will maintain the examination system, and they're going to stress Confucianism, just like the Ming did before them. So Emperor Kangxi will see a huge population boom with new crops like potatoes and maize. The population is going to go from, well, in 1800, it's 400 million. 400 million by the year 1800. Currently, the U.S. population is about 330 million. Agriculture and the land were viewed as sources of wealth according to Confucianism. So this is validation of their respect for these traditions. Now, the new emperor will take this even further when he ordered a thorough census of all land ownings. This is where tax collection comes in. Collection will be more efficient, and the burden is spread out among rich and poor alike, mainly due to all of the data that was compiled in about an 800,000 page encyclopedia. The emperors even used the painting of imperial portraits, like this one you see here, of Pang Shi, to legitimize their rule. And these portraits would be hung in the walls of the Forbidden City, or part of funeral rites. Pang Shi had portraits drawn of himself surrounded by or reading books to emphasize his taste for formal learning. If he's viewed as a Confucian scholar, he's going to earn the approval of elites and thus gain the mandate of heaven. Now, with the Qing, these Manchu will adhere to their cultural traditions. They spoke their native Manchu, they practiced their own form of Buddhism, known as Tibetan Buddhism, and, they have more in common with their Central Asian subjects as opposed to their Chinese subjects. This is where the term Han Chinese is used to distinguish between the Manchu and the ethnic Chinese, and marriage between the two is strictly forbidden. The exception to the desire that the Manchu have to not impose cultural laws was the decree that all men had to embrace the queue, which is the hairstyle you see in the image. All men had to have a single braid in the back, complemented by a shaved forehead. So this gets the ball rolling on the new Qing Dynasty. And it's under the Qing that the Europeans really amp up their efforts. Now, the Portuguese missionaries were the first to arrive in the 1500s. In fact, the Jesuit Matteo Ricci may have been the first European granted access to the Forbidden City. The British are the ones who truly make an impact. Now, due to dramatic increase in Western and mainly British opium sales in China, which goes from 1,150-pound chests in 1773 to about 23,000 of these chests in 1832, the Chinese government tried to take a firm hand against this illegal trade. And it's really destroying China. It's creating many addicts and draining China of its silver supply. Commissioner Lin is a man who's seen as incorruptible. He's sent to South China to stop this. So he seizes the property of foreign drug smugglers, most of whom are wealthy and had established trading firms, and he destroyed chests of opium. He declared drug traders would be beheaded. In response to the perceived outrage of having British property seized and citizens held, the British government sent a fleet to punish the Chinese. So the British had sent up a trading post at Guangzhou, which was called Canton, mainly for teas and silks when opiums become involved. For them, it's a matter of free trade. Britain wasn't so much concerned about the flow of opium, but to keep the trade going. Thanks to their newly industrialized navy, complete with ironclad gunboats, the British were able to achieve a number of victories and blockade key ports like Guangzhou and Shanghai. And many Qing commanders actually committed suicide in disgrace due to the dominance of the Western barbarians. England's dominance allowed them to dictate the terms of the peace treaty. Now, the first of the unequal treaties, Treaty of Nanjing, opened up 5 Chinese ports to British merchants. It's going to restrict Chinese sovereignty, and it will give possession of Hong Kong to the British. And Hong Kong does remain British until 1997. British people in these regions will have what's called extraterritoriality, meaning that the Brits operated under British law rather than Chinese law. So when you look at the Opium Wars, it's a true example of how the Western imperial powers are starting to impose their will on China. Now, as time goes on, China is truly carved up by Western powers. And even though they're not European, you can see that Japan is going to start to make their influence and their presence known. The so-called open door notes were agreed to in the very late 1800s. And these open door notes were accepted very reluctantly. There really wasn't much that the Qing could do about it. Now, the failure of the modernization movement, where the Qing did try to modernize, all right, they did try to revamp their army, revamp their government, but there was an anti-foreign movement that was afoot. This movement was called the Society of the Righteous and Harmonious Fists. These people were called boxers because they practiced martial arts, and foreigners saw them, what appeared to be boxing. When the boxers slaughtered European and Chinese Christians and laid siege to the foreign embassies, they received imperial support as a patriotic group. So a multinational force of about 20,000 troops invaded northern China. They occupied the Forbidden City, and they crushed the movement, exacting more humiliations as revenge. China had to pay 450 million ounces of silver to the occupying forces. So by the end of the 19th century, the once powerful Middle Kingdom is going to find itself in a state of informal empire, losing sovereignty to the Europeans, to the Americans, and in their estimation, worst of all, to the Japanese.